Hello, I'm John Lacey. I'm the director of the Global Mining Law Center at the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona. And this is one of a series of interviews with people that have made important contributions to the mining law and the issues related to the mining law. Uh, Today we have Stan Dempsey, the retired chairman of Royal Gold, who has made some significant contributions to the environmental law and the relationship of the mining industry to environmental law and practices. Stan, thank you very much for doing this today. The what I'd like to visit with you about today is your early experiences with the advent of environmental law and how the place you played in some of the early development. So if you could just start with why don't you start in with your early career leading up to your practices, the things you found at Climax.
I started out as a small mine operator, even while I was still at university. And of course, I took a geology degree first and went to Climax, which was at that time probably the largest underground mine in the world. I think there were 3,000 miners there. And after being a small miner and then seeing how the major corporations did their work, it was a fascinating place to work underground. Then I went to law school, and I'd always been interested in being in the mining industry, and I thought the law would be helpful to me. And but I was also a mountain climber, and I knew a lot of people in the mountaineering and what was called conservation at that time, and wilderness advocates. I knew a lot of these folks, and I knew that they were frustrated with the inability to influence in any way decisions being made by the land managing agencies. So after I came out of law school, I immediately went back to Climax and became, within a year or two, the resident attorney for that large mine.
And about what year was this?
That would have been 1964.
Uh-huh.
And by 1966, Climax had another property about 40 miles away and about 40 miles west of Denver, discovered the Henderson deposit of molybdenite. And it was an ore deposit about 3,000 feet below the valley floor. And again, turned out to be by the time we got it built 10 years later, was one of the biggest mines in the world.
Why don't you explain a little bit on when people hear about molybdenum? It's one of those things that few people can pronounce.
Right.
They usually say Molly be D or Molly be damned. How does that fit into the overall need for metals?
Well, molybdenum was discovered late in the 19th century, and it's sort of a wonder metal. It's used as a ferroalloy to make steel harder, but also tougher. It's a little bit different than some of the other ferroalloys. It also has some properties when it's in the oxide form that make for fire retardants, like kids' pajamas and things like that. In the sulfide form, it's also an excellent lubricant because of the crystal structure of the material. But the main use is to toughen steel, and it really made the automobile possible. And it's also a major wartime requirement for armament.
Uh-huh. Good, thank you. Yeah, go on with. Sorry to interrupt your story there.
I found myself at the right place at the right time as a young lawyer, doing all the contract works for 3,000 foot deep shafts and 9.6 mile long tunnel, and those were challenges, but I could kind of tell from my communication in my personal life with the mountaineering community, they had no idea what we were doing up there. But I could tell that there was a decision made, the so-called Parker decision in Colorado in federal district court, that gave the public some rights to communicate their feelings in the process of planning for new projects like a mine. So that case was later overturned, but of course, we're talking about 5 or 6 years before the National Environmental Policy Act was passed by Congress. And so I went to my bosses, and ultimately the idea of collaborating with the environmental community in Colorado went all the way to the top of the company in New York, and I was worried to death that I'd get fired. But there were a lot of people on the board and at high levels in the company that could also see that coming. One of our directors was the head of the Adirondack State Park Land Use Commission. So people were starting to understand that environment wasn't just protecting resources like air and water. It was also about how we make our decisions about land use. And I think even today, that's still not clear to everybody that when we say environmental issues, we're talking about a couple of different things. Environmental protection and how do we make our decisions, how do we govern ourselves.
So apparently you didn't get fired.
I didn't get fired. And the mine took 10 years to build. It was the largest privately financed big works project in Colorado history, and it took 10 years to build. So the folks, 5 people from the environmental community, most of them past presidents of the Sierra Club chapter in Colorado, served on a committee with us, and every month we would meet. And one month the environmentalists would put on some kind of a educational thing for us, and we would reciprocate a month later. And then as we got into the actual planning of the mine, they were intimately involved in every decision made in the planning of that mine. And some of the things that occurred, one that I always thought was sort of amusing, we invited the president of the local utility company who provided the power lines to the site to join us with the environmentalists, and we would all go take a hike up on top of Jones Pass, which looks down on the side of the mine. And Dick Walker was really a very fine man, but utility executives are not usually thought of as being real liberal. So we're laying on the tundra because we're all out of breath up at high altitude on the Continental Divide, having our lunch. And finally, this wonderful woman, Betty Willard, who later became the member of the Council on Environmental Quality for President Ford, but she was just a marvelous human being. And she looked over at Dick and said, why do you have to make these clear cuts every time you make one of these power lines go through the mountains? I wondered what Dick was going to say and what he thought I got him into. And he said, Betty, I don't know, but I'll find out. And so a month later, Dick came back to meet with us. He said, we don't have to do that. When you give a job to engineers, they generally will do it upright. And if cutting down part of the tree is not good enough, cut it all the way down. He says, we actually can build this thing with not clear cutting. And even to this day, that power line does not have a swath cut through the trees.
Did that influence any of the other decisions that the power company made? Or
I'm not sure. I love them, but they can be interesting to work with sometimes. Yeah. But it was a success. We called it the experiment in ecology. It suddenly, as we were approaching Earth Day, we started to get a lot of publicity at the national level. There was Bob Kahn, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner, wrote a wonderful story about it in the Christian Science Monitor.
That was Earth Day in 1970, right?
70.
Yeah.
And this article would probably have been 68 or 69. And it talked about the collaboration between the company and the environmental community, and was very complimentary. The Udalls wrote a major piece, and I've forgotten whether it was the New York Times or where it was published, but it was also very complimentary of the process that we had invented, I guess you would have to say. This is before impact statements. This is before the major controversies we hear about, before the Clean Water Act. So
the process that you put together there at Climax and Amex also. Amex was the it was Amex the
parent
company. Was did that become the template for operations within Amex after that?
Well, it did in a way. It really propelled me into the vision of the senior management, because this was one siting that actually had no controversy, no delays, and I was asked to head up a special committee corporate-wide very early. I think it would have been probably before, I've forgotten the dates, but very shortly after Earth Day. Mm-hmm. To bring together all the environmental people in different divisions. We had coal, iron ore, lithium. We had practically every commodity with a different division in Amex. And so I was very quickly asked to chair that committee by the chairman of the company. And soon after that, I was asked to put together a staff group to work corporate-wide. And you can imagine there's some politics in a corporation, just like a university. So it was an interesting study in governance too, in a corporate setting. So,
was there much resistance within the company to go forward on this type of a process?
There wasn't resistance on the general idea of getting with it, on learning what our real environmental issues were and how environmental protection issues, clean water, clean air. Mm-hmm. There was always resistance from plant managers. Plant managers are usually, in our industry, considered sort of like the captain of a ship. Mm-hmm. If you want to go to his, in those days, his mine, now it would be his or her mine. But even so, if you go to her mine, you ask permission to come aboard, sir. Uh-huh. And I can remember early in the piece, it was a good thing to be able to bring environmentalists out for a tour. Well, when can they do that? Well, Saturday. I mean, John, you've been around the mining industry all your life. Can you imagine a mine manager allowing a tour of the mine on Saturday? It's just, I mean, we couldn't imagine. They couldn't imagine it. No. They certainly do now. But
how did that affect the collaborative process with in permitting new mines? Did that ethic within Amex continue?
Well, it's interesting that other companies, Rio Tinto at the time, Consink Rio Tinto Australia, there was a lot of back and forth talk between senior level people in companies. The whole industry, like industry broadly, was hit fast by the changes that came about. Not only cleaning up the water, but dealing with the people who were now empowered with more rights than they'd had in the past to communicate about things like environmental impact statements. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of communication. I was asked at one point to go to Bougainville, the Bougainville copper operation of CRA in New Guinea, on the island of Bougainville, and look at what they were doing. We were all trying to figure out how to deal with this. And as to the collaborative model, we also started to learn that as the environmental conflict part of this versus the environmental protection, that over here, collaboration was starting to become not a good thing in the view of a lot of leadership in the environmental community. They felt they were being preempted or talked into something with slick PR. But a lot of environmental leaders enjoyed not collaborating in order to build the size of their organization. So there was some. What I want to say is that I've always liked collaboration. I think it's the best thing, but it's in the setting we're in now. It's not very often possible.
You think that's a matter of timing and getting involvement with other interested groups?
I do. I think that the experiment in ecology for Amex worked because at that time, companies had most of the power in the overall conflict situation. Mm-hmm. The laws were there. If we met them, we could do what we wanted to do. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, after the other side of the issue, the environmental activists, and I'll put them different than the environmentalists, the activists have now got the power, or the power is more evenly balanced, or maybe even a little bit balanced toward the environmental activist side of it. I participated in an interesting Ford Foundation funded project out at the University of Washington that studied these things, and they reckoned that the evenness of power made a difference. Mm-hmm.
Did you see any difference once the National Environmental Policy Act was passed and there were specific rules or specific procedures as to how to follow the process? Did it make things easier or harder?
In my view, I've always been a proponent of environmental impact statement feature of that law. I always think if you got the truth and the facts, you can sort out the governance issues a lot faster. Mm-hmm. So I've always liked that part of it. I don't think that. I think the litigation that came out of NEPA and the tactics that came out of NEPA have not been so happy. Mm-hmm. For the country and for anybody. We have a problem with congestion on I-70, the interstate highway in Colorado, to the ski areas. It's been going on 10 or 15 years. Nobody's getting anything out of the mess we're in there. It's largely because of, in my judgment, improper use of the law.
Well, I think one of the advantages we have in this type of a process is we can inject our recommendations in terms of policy.
Right.
How do you think that NEPA, or at least the environmental impact statement process, what would you like to see changed there?
I think mainly the delay aspects of it, the delay as a tactic to stop a project. What we're really talking about is a land use issue, in most cases, not an environmental issue. Mm-hmm. If there's truly an environmental issue that we don't understand enough to do, we shouldn't do it. Mm-hmm. But if these are pretty straightforward things, if we don't want to build or don't want to improve I-70, let's say so and quit studying it.
But that's obviously a problem with new mines because
sure.
the mines can't be moved,
right.
Or at least the mineral deposits
right.
can't be moved.
No, you asked me whether it was a good thing. Yes, I think the NEPA, the impact statement, is a good thing, and used the way it was supposed to be used, I'm very supportive of doing that. I had the opportunity to do the first coal mine impact statement in the country at the Bel Air mine in Wyoming. And we didn't have any forms. So we had to make it up. Uh-huh. And pretty much most impact statements are now done in that format. Mm-hmm. But you had to figure out how to do it. Uh-huh. It was very interesting to do. But now in that situation, I think that impact statement was something like 28 or 30 pages, plus, of course, the appendices There were wildlife studies, there were hydrology studies, and they amounted to quite a fistful of paper. But today, an impact statement may be the size of what used to be the phone book.
Yeah, and sometimes 3 or 4 volumes with
Sure.
the attachment.
Right.
Now, of course, the process in preparation of the environmental impact statement is really to give a basis or an understanding of the environmental impact to the decision maker.
Right.
Do that particular, and one of the problems that industry has had seems to be the number of decisions or the number of permits that that people have, or that mines or other large projects have to go through. Do you have any thoughts on that process?
Well, I sure do. No, I think, as you say, the multitude of permits that need. There have been efforts over the years to try to coordinate or streamline the process, and to the extent that that doesn't preempt real study of a real problem, I think that putting together a fast track is a good idea. We had a project with Amex in Crested Butte, Colorado, that became extremely controversial. But the state of Colorado, Governor, I believe it was Governor Lamb, and Harris Sherman, who was the Department of Natural Resources head, came to us and said, "We challenge Amex to join in a Colorado review process. We'll streamline this, and we'll also empower people like the county to get what they need to work with to be part of the bargain." So we ended up funding the Gunnison County to get computers that they needed for their own land use planning. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was a sensible thing. I mean, even if the answer comes out no, if you make the system work, it'll eventually generate an answer.
You've had some experience in other countries too.
Yes.
I recall you've told me about some of the processes in England.
Right.
Would you talk about that a little bit?
Again, the mountaineering comes into this a little bit. I was over often on a Saturday when I was traveling for Amex. I'd race out into the countryside and do some mountaineering. So I climbed Mount Snowdon, and I found out that there'd been a major conflict there between one of the major companies in the UK and the environmental community. And I started looking into it, and I found some favorable sentiment by the environmental community that was connected to the onshore impacts of offshore oil and gas drilling in the North Sea, which was a major thing that occurred for the UK and nationwide economic boom that came along. Even in the Sierra Club Journal, I believe there was an article praising the way the Town and Country Planning Act, which is their national land use planning act, procedure. And I thought, gosh, if the environmental community likes it, maybe we ought to go look at it and see if it might be a model if we ever have to have that kind of legislation here on a national basis. And so I put together a team to go look at the situation in the UK. At that time, Lord Zuckerman, who had been the chief science advisor to the British government, was available. He was a great systems engineer and ecologist. And so we had Zuckerman put the thing together, this tour, and we went to the national parks because they actually mine in the national parks in the UK, and there's plenty of controversy surrounding it.
What kind of mines would they have there?
The Yorkshire Dales, for example, have a major potash mine, underground potash mine. There's a tungsten mine, wolframite, huberite, in the Lake District National Park. I mean, one of the most beautiful places in the world, Lake Windermere, all that.
Uh-huh.
A small tungsten mine, which they regard as part of the cultural heritage of the area. So
And so this would be another underground mine?
it's a small underground mine.
Uh-huh.
I'd say
Okay.
100 tons a day.
Uh-huh.
But it ranges from very large to very small.
Mm-hmm.
But the UK doesn't have much mineral to waste. So they'll mine it everywhere if they can do it without ruining the other values that these parks are set aside for.
Yeah. So how did this particular Town and Country Act work?
Basically, no matter what you want to do with your property in terms of modification, let's say you want to build a garden shed, you have to put that to the county council. If that gets worked out at the county level, all the small things do tend to be done that way. If you come in with a nuclear power plant or a port for an oil field, it's going to get called in, is the language they use.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be called into the national government for review. At that time, there'll be a decision made whether there should be an impact statement. Then, you don't spend $500,000 on an impact statement for a garden shed that might touch a federal power line or something. It's a very, the British invented our way of doing law. John, you know that as well as I do. But they know how to manage their activities.
But do you have the same polarization between the separate parties that we seem to find in this country?
Yes, but they're pretty civil about, at the end of the day, working it out.
Mm-hmm.
The consequences can be the same. In the area of Snowdonia National Park, there was a proposal to mine a copper mine in the park in front of everybody, and also a placer deposit of gold out in the estuary. Neither one of those have gone forward.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in the piece has been taken care of in the way that they do in England. It's resolved in a gentleman and gentle lady approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, using this background, do you have any suggestions as to how the process in the United States might be changed a bit?
Well, I've also worked in Australia, as you know, and when you build a very large mine in Australia, the Parliament actually passes a statute embracing all of the elements that are going to be required. In the case that I was involved with, Mount Newman, there's a major railroad. I guess it's the biggest, heaviest hauling railroad in the world, 235 kilometers to the sea from the mine to the port. There's a town of several thousand people. There's a police force. None of that was there when we first went out there. Every part of the structure of the relationship between the state and the companies that were involved, all of that's embraced in a statute. And I think for the really large projects, that's a pretty sensible way to do it, because all the political accommodation that's necessary to make these things work is embodied in that one thing. So the companies have certainty. They can raise the capital that's required.
Mm-hmm.
The deleterious effect of some of our delays here are largely in the capital raising issues. Mm-hmm. You can't finance a mine that has that much uncertainty. There in Australia, once everybody's got their piece of the pie all organized, the royalty rates with the government are set, what the police are supposed to do, the airport that we had to build and things like that are all worked out. Who's going to pay for which? Mm-hmm. It's a pretty good system.
Was the statute at the provincial level?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, Western Australia would have been our. I think that act has been amended several times because the needs of the mine or the expansions of the mine required some adjustments from time to time. But I haven't talked to my colleagues there lately about their attitude toward that procedure. But just looking at it from 30,000 feet, and having been there 30 years ago, it seemed to work pretty well to me compared to what we're doing now. I think we want the review. I think we want the political accommodations that need to be done, but we need to make a decision a little faster so we just don't waste all of our resources. We're finding out the U.S. has not got as much to waste as we used to.
So, are you saying that basically what we need to do is find a system of consolidating the permitting system in such a way that you either have a go or no go at some point?
Right. And I'm looking at that more from a national point of view, not from a corporate point of view. Just, yeah, I think wasting money on studies that are not really needed is not a good thing.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you very much for your insight on the process. I think it's very helpful in making the type of reviews that we need to take a look at going forward. So thank you very much, Stan, for participating in this. This we will include this as part of the overall process to inform or educate the next generation of folks dealing with the permitting.
Well, I'm impressed
industry.
with the questions that you asked, because they certainly put it up where we could talk about it.
Okay, thanks, Stan.